And with that, we are live. Welcome to another edition of the Astro Weather for today, the 15th of February, 2023. I hope you all got your flowers yesterday. That's an expression the kids use. They deserve their flowers. Well, yesterday was one of those flower days. And if you didn't get your flowers, I extend an invisible bouquet to you out there who deserve your flowers. Anybody who's around during this time in humanity deserves their flowers. Just saying. Welcome to another edition of Astro Weather. And we're going to try to keep it under the 25-minute mark today. That's my goal. So why don't we just jump right in and start to see what's going on with the celestial influences in our daily life. Terrestrial weather out here is looking pretty good today. A few random clouds in the sky. We've had some really brutal winds over the last couple of days. And in fact, from a meteorological standpoint, West Texas had like 60-mile-per-hour winds. It was crazy. There were tractor trailer rigs that were blown off the highway. Pretty intense stuff, right? Like on their sides. So the winds have subsided slightly, but the winds of interchange constantly stir. So today we're going to look at what's going on. Now, the thing that really grabbed me is the T-square with the moon, Venus, Neptune. We have this really, really close conjunction with Venus, Neptune. And it's a very different kind of energy than Sun, Saturn, right? These are very different energies. Venus, Neptune just wants to merge. It's like, can't we all just get along? Can't we all just find the namaste in each and every one of us? The God of me recognizes and greets the God in you. So there's that kind of universal level with Venus and Pisces. And it's at the third decan, so it's putting it in the Scorpio decan. So when you get into this and the blurring of the boundaries in personal relationships, you're really letting down your psychological guard, because the eighth house in Scorpio is the realm of deep psychology. So there really is a pretty deep level of surrender when we get into the third decan of Pisces. And it's one of those aspects that in a lot of ways speaks to the inherent good of humanity, which has been unfortunately tragically tarnished since the year 2001. We'll just go back to 2001. And so we have to learn how to discern. We have to learn how to create limits. We have to learn how to create boundaries, because our trust has been broken. The social contract is now shattered. A million pieces scattered across the land, across the planet. There is no social contract. And yet we're yearning in a lot of ways for some kind of union, right? Some kind of communion with something that's transcendent, and that we want to live it every day, and we want to see it in the world around us, in our relationships at the highest octave of Pisces. Unfortunately, today is one of those days where that might not happen, because we have the moon coming in Sagittarius, which really is like a major howling gust of truth, right? Like the moon in Sagittarius it's the madman and the king and King Lear, and they're kind of howling against the wind in the dark night of the soul of the king from King Lear. But it's kind of like that. The moon in Sagittarius is, stick your head out the window and say, I'm mad as hell. I'm not going to take it anymore. It's about emotional authenticity and truth. I mean, Sagittarius is about truth. And so here we have the moon creeping up on the galactic center today. And it's not in harmony with can't we all just get along? The other thing too is when we look at what happened in East Palestine, I always think the name of East Palestine to be, we don't call it Palestine, call it Palestine, but East Palestine is significant, right? Because Palestine, we have the other Palestine, theoretically on the other side of the Atlantic, the other side of the world, which is always subjected to some form of either socio-political or even environmental violation. So it's an interesting mirror. And what are we dealing with there? We're dealing with water. We're dealing with the evaporation of gases, which are very Piscean, by the way. And now this whole disaster is getting into the water supply. And here's the moon in Sagittarius, and it's howling, right? It's clamoring, doing its best to process the truth of the situation. So this Venus-Neptune conjunction, while it would be beautiful and wonderful to just transcend, the moon is not going to let that happen. And neither is Mars, still in a wide square, right? People want to know what's going on. What are the answers here? And there are no answers, right? And this is from a mundane level. And you get into this Mars square with Neptune, and the challenge here is engaging in sound and fury. And then what comes of it, right? So we have to emotionally express ourselves. And in the collective, or in the theater of the mundane, we're tied to this now. We're moving into this Aquarian world through social media, through broadcasting, through people having pods, through having information shot across our screens 24/7, right? So we're in it now. Like, we cannot divest ourselves of the collective and mundane theater. We're in it. We're part of it. It's part of us. So when something happens like this, it's personal. It's personal. So Mars here, how do we resolve it, right? How do we resolve the fact that something egregious has happened? And a lot of people believe that this is a thing that might have been actually triggered and or staged. Because again, we go back to the social contract shattered into a million pieces. How can we not look at any event now through the eyes of the innocent? Well, shit happens. It's human error. Government is inefficient. And so now we have Mars coming in, and people are screaming at the top of their lungs, and they're flapping their wings, and they're stomping their feet. And what's happening? You have to be really careful in situations like this. Very, very careful, because we know that there has been a grave injustice done against the environment and the people in that area. And that's on the collective level. This has personal ramifications. But if you get really worked up and there's no resolution, and really this is the problem of the time that we're living in, is there's no resolution, there's no closure. Today I was on Twitter and I saw that there was a number of tweets about the Epstein documents. Do you know when I started to talk about Jeffrey Epstein? I started talking about Jeffrey Epstein in 2016. I was talking about Jeffrey Epstein 7 years ago. 7 years ago. And here we are, 7 years later, a Saturn cycle, and we're finally starting to see some documents. Finally. In the meantime, we're dealing with one of the greatest environmental crises and disasters since the Exxon Valdez in Alaska in this country. So you have to be careful. You have to be very careful. You have to be able to emote what you're feeling. But if nothing comes of it, with the Mars-Neptune square, what happens? It's demoralizing. Demoralizing. In the green economy, they talk about offsets and they talk about carbon credits. So you have to have an offset. We have the Mars-Jupiter sextile. So what does that mean? It means that with Mars and Gemini, you have to double track. You have to be able to work at least two levels at once. So while you're in there and out there looking at the world around you and seeing the grand malfeasance unfold before our very eyes, you also have to self-improve. That's a big part of this. You have to self-improve. You have to say to yourself, well, if the world isn't perfect and it feels like that there is an enormous conspiracy against the living, then how do I keep on living? What do I need to do to stay in the game? And that's the Mars-Jupiter sextile. Remember, Jupiter in Aries is self-directed. So with Mars and Gemini, you have to work two tracks. Do not sacrifice one for the other. You have to be aware and be open to what's happening. Because if you're not, and some people could say that there's a strategy in what me worry. But I don't think you can get out of it now. Even the people who live in caves, eventually reality or so-called reality will reach them. It reminds me of a story by Krishnamurti. And in one of his talks, he had a student, and the student decided that they were not going to ever deal with the chaos and the catastrophe of the world. And so this student was able to basically stay in their home and not have to deal with the outside world. Well, guess what? The outside world came to the student in the form of interruptions and salespeople. And so what Krishnamurti was saying is that you cannot turn away or walk away from the world, that you have to navigate through the world. Of course, Krishnamurti's advice would be just watch what happens. Observe yourself. Observe how you act. So here we have Sun Saturn, which is very different, right? It's a very different energy than Venus Neptune. Venus Neptune wants to merge. It doesn't want any kind of division. Sun Saturn says we want boundaries. We want repercussions. We want law. We want the enforcement of law. Saturn is the enforcement of law. Jupiter is the philosophical creation of law. Saturn is the enforcement of law. So with the moon in Sagittarius, what do we want? We want justice. We want truth. We want it, and we want it now. And how much can people take? How much can they take on the collective and the mundane? That's a big question. I don't know the answer to that. We're resilient people. We're a resilient species, but there's only so much. If you're traumatized in an abusive relationship, there comes a breaking point. No matter how much you can take, there always comes a breaking point. With Pluto coming into Aquarius not long from now, I think we're going to have an interesting opportunity to look inside of this very dark place that we're headed towards in a lot of ways, which will be the trigger and the catalyst for us to hopefully, possibly do something different. When we see something that happened in a place like East Palestine, Ohio, and the tragedy and the absolute and utter calamity that is going to follow downstream and downwind, and the idea that this can get into the Mississippi River and pollute thousands and thousands of acres of farmland and groundwater. What is it going to take for people to wake up? I'll cover more of this on my 15 Minutes of Flame show if you're interested. I don't want to get too much into it, but we are in this theater of collective events. This is what Pluto in Aquarius is bringing us, right? It's bringing us in this field, bringing us to this field where we have this shared perception, or this shared reality. It's unavoidable. So where does the collective experience and the individual experience end to begin? That's a really good question. And this is where we get into the Venus-Neptune conjunction, right? And we're also really testing our spiritual beliefs with Venus-Neptune. If you're a transcendent type, you have Mars coming in and the moon coming in today, it's testing you. It's testing your ability to live up to your spiritual ideals, to live up to things like forgiveness and surrender, and understanding that there is a good/God in each and every one of us. It's a very interesting day. Meanwhile, Sun Saturn demands judgment, demands limits, demands repercussion. I would say today is a very charged day and very different energies happening across the board. Mercury's separating from Pluto, but it's moving into more of a sextile with Mars. Mercury's a trickster, right? It is Hermes. And in Aquarius, it's brilliant, it's radical, it's contrarian. I would say that this is a day where the meme warriors are out, right? The meme warriors, keep your eye on David Wolf's feed, the king of the meme. And sometimes memes can be really, really good at addressing things in a deeply psychological way that can blow off steam and create multiple levels of meaning. And I'm not saying you should go out and become a meme warrior, but it's one of those days, right? And humor, I think today would be very good. It would be an excellent bromide for the chaos of the world and the malfeasance and the fact that nobody is talking about what happened in East Palestine. So sharpen your humor and sharpen your wit. And do your best to double track. Because if you're just shaking your fist at the world right now, it's going to drain you. It's going to drain you. So you have to be building yourself up at the same time so that you don't deplete your energy. I think this is a very interesting day. Very, very interesting day. And we'll be covering more of this over on 15 Minutes of Flame. All right, let's take a look at the star of the day. Now, it's always interesting when I sit down and look like who's going to be the star of the day. Who are the worthy candidates? And there were at least three in my mind last night that I was pondering. One was Chris Farley, because there are interesting correlations to Chris Farley and John Belushi, right? They're both these big, overweight, funny guys from Saturday Night Live who had immense drug appetites. And they're both Aquarians. I was tempted to go Chris Farley, because you can see in Chris Farley's chart the enormous appetites of Chris Farley. Then I thought about Sarah Jane Moore. Who is Sarah Jane Moore, you ask? She was a member of the Manson family. She has the distinct honor, I suppose, of being a member of the Manson family, who does not go to prison, but instead tries to kill Gerald Ford. I guess it was September 22nd, 1974, if I'm not mistaken, in San Francisco. She goes to assassinate Ford. And when you look at her chart, can you say mind control and programming all over that chart? What's also interesting is she has a Pluto in Cancer. And Gerald Ford's son, Gerald Ford was a Cancer. His son was right on her Pluto, right? So she was targeted. She was programmed. Sarah Jane Moore was programmed. She's your little Manchurian candidate. Unfortunately, she didn't get the job done. Well, unfortunately for the programmers. I don't want to get into a dissertation on Gerald Ford, but that's a dark individual. That said, she did not make the cut. Today's star of the day is probably one of the most important Americans that many of you have not heard of. History has buried this person and has not been kind to them, but an incredibly influential person who was taken from us far too soon. Who is that person? His name is James Forrestal. James Forrestal was the commander of the Navy during World War II. And then he was promoted to be the Secretary of Defense under Harry Truman. He's a very interesting character. He made a shit ton of money on Wall Street when he was younger. He didn't really need the money, so he decided to go full on into the United States Navy, serving the Navy, serving the country. And this guy was the epitome of what we would call a patriot. So here's one of his quotes. He's got some interesting quotes. Courage is the capacity to conduct oneself with restraint in times of prosperity, and with courage and tenacity when things do not go well. I'll read that for you again. Courage is the capacity to conduct oneself with restraint in times of prosperity, and with courage and tenacity when things do not go well. So courage is a two-edged sword, according to Forrestal. So Forrestal is interesting because there are two things that he becomes known for. Number one, his hatred of the Russians or the Soviets, did not like them. Number two, his decidedly American, pro-American stance. You know, when we think of America, we think of cancer because America is a cancer country. July 4th, 1776. And he has cancer on the ascendant. Cancer rising people tend to be fairly conservative in their outward expression. Fairly conservative. Apparently, Forrestal was an incredible athlete as well. He was an amateur boxer, and according to one of the historians that I ran across, he could have been a professional golfer or even tennis player. That's how high of a level athlete he was. He's a very interesting character, deeply pro-American. And one of his quotes was that the way to win the war, the long war, is to essentially free every country in the world so that they could be economically prosperous and engage in a global network of industry, production, and trade. So he was very pro-capitalism in its kind of purest distillation. Now, of course, the globalists would take his lead or take his ideas and transform them into something very different. A bit of an idealist, but nonetheless, he had the right idea. Also, when we look at his chart, we see the moon down here in Libra. So it's 0 Libra, and he's very fair, right? He's a very fair guy in a lot of ways. And the moon down in the 4th house is the ruler of his chart. So again, you know, we talk about Cancer, we talk about home and country, and Forrestal represents a lot of these values. And you can see the stoicism here with Saturn conjuncting his moon, right? He's very stoic. He comes out of this kind of tradition of like Marcus Aurelius, right, and the great Stoics. Saturn also places a great deal of pressure on him as well. He deals with a lot of pressure. And you can see it here with the opposition to his midheaven. He's got an Aries midheaven, and he's a commander in the Navy, right? Commander in the Navy. He's got Jupiter and Pisces, ninth house. He's dealing with things like foreign policy. He's dealing with places like Okinawa in Japan and the Pacific Theater. This is a guy who ran an investigation on Pearl Harbor. He's a wild card. And with his Aquarian sun in the eighth house, and even Mercury, or James Forrestal, was the recipient of hidden and occulted knowledge. He was on Harry S. Truman's secret panel for extraterrestrial evidence in ufology. James Forrestal knew some things. He knew things that put him at risk. That's number one. Number two, and again, this is a byproduct, I think, of Forrestal's chart. You know, he's got that Mars in Sagittarius. So he's a fighter, right? Mars in Sagittarius, he's a warrior for truth. And he's got this sextile with Mercury. You know, and he wants to speak the truth and act on the truth. And when you deal with Sagittarius, you're dealing with other countries. I think this is where he gets into trouble, because he begins to speak out against Israel. He was not a fan of Israel. He was not a fan of the plan, and openly stated, look, we do not want to piss off the oil producing allies that we have in this region. Now, remember, this is 1948. Harry Truman is president, and Harry Truman's unstated goal is to recognize the nation state of Israel. That is in partially why Harry Truman got elected. I'll get into that maybe some other time. But Forrestal was in opposition, right? There's a lot of opposition in this chart. He was in opposition to the recognition of the state of Israel. So now we have a guy who's sitting on a power. This is one of the most powerful people in the world at that time. He was the Secretary of Defense for one of the greatest developing armies and navies. By the way, he creates the Air Force. He spins the Air Force out of the Army. There's no Air Force before Forrestal. That was part of the Army. And his goal, again, wasn't just to wage war or to defend the country or to defeat our greatest foe, which really was the communists, who were basically bankrolled by the international banking community. He knew all of this stuff, right? He knew it all. But it was also to create economic prosperity. There was a whole other level of, bringing this idea of America in its truest sense to the world. So what happens to Forrestal? He creates enemies. He has the press turns on him. The press turns on him, and Harry S. Truman and his inner circle begin to turn on him as well. And James Forrestal because this, right, and he's a purist. There's another little interesting tidbit about Forrestal. I watched a couple of interviews with him last night, or not interviews with him, but interviews with people who've done research. They're terrible interviews, by the way. They could have been so much better. If you're interested in the life and death of James Forrestal, David Martin, not the David Bowtie Martin, but David Martin, who is a researcher, and he did a book on the death of Thomas Merton. He's done another book on the death of James Forrestal. So if you're interested in learning more about James Forrestal and what happened to him, I'd recommend the book, because I think This David Martin's a good researcher, although the interview that I saw with him last night was not that good. So what happened during the period where James Forrestal was under immense pressure and theoretically committed suicide from his hospital room in Bethesda, Maryland, at the Bethesda Naval Hospital? He was going through immense pressure. This is what was going on with James Forrestal. Here we see Pluto conjuncting Chiron in his chart. Now, this is when he actually theoretically committed suicide. The 2 a.m., May 22nd, 1949, 1 year after Israel creates its independence. How James Forrestal supposedly committed suicide was he tied a series of bed sheets to his neck, ran out of his room, ran across the hall to the room on the other side of the hall, where he jumped out of that room and hanged himself with his bed sheets. Makes no sense. Could have just done it in his own room. But here we have, guess what? The true node in Taurus. And what do we have here? We have Algol. Where's Mars? Mars is in Taurus, approaching his true node, which is on the porch of Algol. And we know that Algol represents what? Hangings, lynchings, the things that we associate with the neck. So astrologically, Mars is in place. But the real question is did he do it? Now, this is a guy that lived with immense pressure all the time with this Mars-Pluto opposition, Mars-Neptune opposition. Again, he's in the Navy, right? He's the commander of the Navy, the entire naval fleet. It's James Forrestal. They named an aircraft carrier after him. So we can see this Mars-Pluto opposition, but it's intense, right? It's taut with pressure. So that's just in his chart. And here we have the sun illuminating this tension and this pressure, right? And here we have Pluto, not just on his Chiron, but also opposing his sun. This is a guy who was under extreme pressure. Saturn also opposing his sun. So we have Pluto and Saturn coming in from both these angles. Saturn, of course, being the authority. Saturn, of course, being connected to hierarchies. And here in Leo, it's pretty dominant. And this guy knew a lot. He had a lot of secrets. And at the time of his death, he has Black Moon Lilith in Aries, right on his midheaven. Aries, of course, is the head as well. So we look at the moon, and we look at the shadow of the moon. So there was something shadowy about his death, just based on the position of Black Moon Lilith. And in Aries, we're dealing with the military. Now, this is just coming out of when the OSS becomes the CIA. Here we have Uranus also making this transit through his 12th house. And it had been there for a while, right? And the pressure, the immense pressure on this guy, just in general in his life, very, very intense. But this is a very important person in terms of how things pivot and turn. Like, people talk about the Kennedy timeline. When Kennedy is assassinated, there's a James Forrestal timeline. This guy was he was the head of the most powerful fighting force in the world. He was the Patton of the seas in a lot of ways. And he was very progressive when it came to ideas of defense, sovereignty, and security. He saw things from a global perspective, but he wasn't a globalist. So this is a very interesting chart. And it's unfortunate that his persona and his legacy has been completely obscured, and that a lot of people just think of him as the crazy guy that jumped out the window. This was a person who knew a lot, in some ways saw the future, and maybe even being a part of Truman's council on UFOs and extraterrestrial intelligence, because there's a guy that has spent 30 years, he's a UFO researcher, spent 30 years looking into James Forrestal's life. And this part of his life is part of the pressure and intensity that he lived with and dealt with. That's our star of the day. A fallen hero and a forgotten star in a different constellation of our history. So if you want to hear more about stuff like this, why don't you come on over to 15 Minutes of Flame. Let me get up my graphic. I'll be there at 9/11 Central Standard Time. Here's the graphic. So one of the things that people will always ask, where's the link? Where's the link? I leave the link in the show notes, but it's really, really simple. And I don't mean to sound pedantic, but all you have to do is go to 15minutesofflame.com. And there are these it's this really old and antiquated feature. They're called bookmarks. They work amazingly. All you got to do is click the bookmark of 15 Minutes of Flame, and you can just go there. Just go into your bookmarks. Go, that's where I want to go. Right. So the important part is it's OF, not OV. And we're there from 9/11 to 10:41 a.m. Today, we'll be talking more about what happened in East Palestine and other things. Before I go, I got to give a shout out to our sponsor, which I do at the end of the show. And that is TrueHempScience.com. And if you go to True Hemp Science, there are a number of really terrific hemp products there, organically sourced, and with great oversight by Chris, who is a friend of the show, and a friend, period. Organically sourced, and the amount of work and attention to detail that he puts into his business is inspiring, actually, knowing that his resources are Spartan, to say the least. So if you're interested in the edibles, the gummies, I can't stress enough how much of a real game changer those gummies have been for my sleep. You go to truehempscience.com/ref/23, and you spend $100, type in 15MINS, and you'll get some free product thrown your way. That's truehempscience.com/ref/23. And 15 mins. Get that free product, spend $100, support a business, improve the quality of your life. In the words of Alex Jones, it's a 360 win. All right, thanks for being here. Please join us at 15 Minutes of Flame, where we turn the heat up on the topics of the day. Take care. Have a great day, and bye for now.